The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, somewhere over the Hindu Kush mountains of Afghanistan. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reaper Davidson pressed his headset tighter against his ear, straining to catch the transmission breaking through the atmospheric interference. What he heard made his blood run cold. Overlord, this is Neptune 7. We have multiple KIA. Request immediate CAS. Grid reference follows. The voice belonged to Senior Chief Petty Officer Jake Bulldog Morrison, leader of SEAL Team 7's Alpha Squad. Morrison's voice never wavered, not even when his team had been pinned down for 6 hours in Fallujah back in '04. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, there was a tremor. The operations center at Bagram Airfield erupted into controlled chaos. Monitors flickered with thermal signatures, satellite feeds painted mountainous terrain in green and black, and the constant hum of processors calculating flight paths filled the sterile air. Davidson's fingers danced across his keyboard, pulling up Neptune 7's last known position. They were deep in Taliban territory, 40 clicks from the nearest fob, surrounded by peaks that rose like ancient sentinels into the star-drunk sky. Neptune 7, Overlord copies. Stand by for immediate CAS. Davidson's response was automatic, professional, but his mind was already racing through available assets. The Apache squadrons were grounded for maintenance. The Predator drones were committed to another operation. The AC-130 Spectre was refueling. That left only one option, and it wasn't one he was eager to deploy. Hangar 7 sat in perpetual shadow at the far end of the airfield, home to the 455th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron's most unconventional pilot. The F-16C Fighting Falcon parked inside bore nose art that had become legendary among ground troops, a raven-haired woman in pilot's gear, eyes fierce as winter storms, wings spread wide beneath the name Shadowhawk. But it wasn't the artwork that made other pilots whisper. It was the pilot herself. Captain Lyra Shadowhawk Castellanos had been the subject of more rumors than confirmed kills, though her official record spoke for itself. 37 successful CAS missions, 0 friendly fire incidents, and a reputation for threading the needle between mountain peaks in weather that grounded seasoned pilots. The problem wasn't her skill, it was everything else. The way she kept to herself. The way she flew patterns other pilots couldn't follow. The way she'd earned her call sign, not in some barroom bravado session, but during a classified operation that had gone so sideways, even the after-action reports were redacted. Davidson hesitated, his cursor hovering over her contact information. In 43 minutes, Neptune 7 would be overrun. The SEALs needed someone who could fly in the dark, navigate by instinct, and deliver ordnance with surgical precision. They needed Shadowhawk. The question was whether she was ready for what waited in those mountains, and whether Neptune 7 was ready for her. The static cleared momentarily, carrying Morrison's voice across the miles. Overlord, we're running out of time. Captain Castellanos was already suiting up when the call came through her personal communicator. She'd been awake since 200, unable to sleep, staring at the photograph tucked inside her helmet, a picture of 8 men in desert fatigues, arms thrown over each other's shoulders, grins wide as Texas sky. 7 of those faces belonged to SEAL Team 7. The 8th belonged to her brother. Miguel Ghost Castellanos had been Neptune 7's forward air controller until an IED had claimed him 3 years ago. The team had carried his body 12 miles through enemy territory, refusing to leave him behind, fighting their way to an extraction zone while Lyra provided cover from above. They'd never spoken of it afterward, but the shared grief had forged something deeper than unit cohesion. It had created family. Now that family was in trouble. She moved through her pre-flight check with mechanical precision, each switch and gauge a familiar prayer. The F-16's engine whined to life, a banshee's cry that cut through the Afghan night. Ground crews scattered as she taxied toward the runway, her aircraft's silhouette barely visible against the tarmac. The nose art caught the glow of runway lights, that fierce-eyed woman who'd become her signature, painted there after her first deployment by a crew chief who'd said she reminded him of his daughter. Tower, Shadowhawk requesting immediate departure, emergency CAS mission. Her voice carried the clipped professionalism of a pilot who'd learned to bury emotion beneath procedure. But tonight, with Neptune 7's lives hanging in the balance, that burial felt impossibly shallow. Shadowhawk Tower, you're cleared for immediate departure runway 27, Godspeed. The afterburners kicked in, pinning her against her ejection seat as the Fighting Falcon accelerated down the runway. At 180 knots, she pulled back on the stick, and the earth fell away beneath her. The Hindu Kush mountains rose ahead like the backbone of a sleeping giant, their peaks crowned with snow that gleamed silver in the moonlight. Somewhere among those ridges, 8 Navy SEALs were fighting for their lives. Lyra banked northeast, climbing to 25,000 feet, her radar painting the landscape below in electromagnetic detail. The flight to Neptune 7's position would take 18 minutes at full throttle, 18 minutes for her to transform from the woman who carried her brother's memory like a stone in her chest into the surgical instrument of warfare her country needed. But as she streaked through the thin air above Afghanistan, Lyra Castellanos allowed herself one moment of purely human emotion. She touched the photograph in her helmet and whispered a prayer in Spanish, the same prayer her grandmother had taught her as a child, the same prayer she'd spoken over Miguel's grave. Tonight, she would be their angel of death. Tonight, she would bring Neptune 7 home. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, strained now with the weight of command and circumstance. Overlord, this is Neptune 7. We have wounded. Hostiles closing from 3 sides. Where's our air support? Davidson's response carried across the mountains. Neptune 7, Shadowhawk is inbound. ETA 17 minutes. There was a pause, pregnant with significance. Then Morrison's voice returned, different now, carrying a note Lyra had heard only once before, on the day they'd carried Miguel home. Shadowhawk, the call sign hung in the air between them like a bridge across time and grief. Holy shit, Lyra. She didn't respond immediately. Couldn't. The professional mask she wore as carefully as her oxygen mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing the sister beneath the soldier, the woman beneath the warrior. When she finally keyed her microphone, her voice was steady as mountain stone. Neptune 7, this is Shadowhawk. I'm coming to get you boys home. The terrain below shifted from barren foothills to the knife-edge ridges of the Himalayas' western reaches. At this altitude, the air was thin enough that a pilot could see the curve of the Earth, could glimpse the infinite darkness of space beyond the atmospheric glow. But Lyra's attention was focused entirely on the tactical display, painting her helmet's heads-up display with symbols and coordinates. Neptune 7's position appeared as a blue diamond, surrounded by expanding red circles. Enemy positions, identified by satellite surveillance and drone reconnaissance. The tactical situation was textbook nightmare. The SEAL team had been conducting a high-value target elimination mission when their primary objective had turned into an elaborate trap. Intelligence reports had missed a Taliban commander's conference, turning what should have been a surgical strike into a hornet's nest. Now Morrison's team was pinned down in a natural bowl formation, surrounded by elevated firing positions, with limited ammunition and no clear extraction route. Lyra's fingers flew across her weapons panel, cycling through ordnance options. 4 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders, and 511 rounds of 20 cannon ammunition. Standard loadout for a CAS mission, but this situation was anything but standard. The enemy forces were dug into positions dangerously close to Neptune 7's location. Any miscalculation could turn her from savior to executioner. Shadowhawk Neptune 7. We're taking heavy fire from elevated positions bearing 45, 120, and 280 degrees. Estimate 40 to 60 hostiles. Break. We have 2 wounded, 1 critical. Need immediate suppression of enemy positions to enable extraction. Morrison's voice carried the clinical precision of a professional warrior, but Lyra could hear the underlying desperation. They were running out of time, ammunition, and luck. She banked her F-16 into a diving turn, dropping from 25,000 to 15,000 feet in a controlled spiral that would bring her over the target area from the northwest. The landscape below resolved into startling detail. Ancient stone walls marking terraced fields, mud brick compounds clustered around precious water sources, and the geometric patterns of modern military positions carved into timeless mountainsides. Neptune 7, Shadowhawk. I have eyes on your position, marking friendly location with green smoke. Morrison's acknowledgement came immediately. A thin column of emerald smoke rose from the boulder field where the SEALs had taken cover, a beacon in the wilderness that meant the difference between salvation and catastrophe. Lyra rolled inverted, pulling her aircraft through a descending spiral that brought the target area into perfect alignment with her targeting systems. The first enemy position materialized in her heads-up display, a fortified firing point built into a natural cave system, muzzle flashes strobing like deadly fireflies in the pre-dawn darkness. Neptune 7, Shadowhawk is hot. Danger close on position Alpha. Shadowhawk, danger close authorized. We trust you. Those 4 words, we trust you, carried the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. Miguel's death, the team's loyalty, her own need for redemption wrapped in wings and ordnance. Senior Chief Morrison pressed himself against the boulder's cold surface, feeling the vibrations of incoming rounds chipping away at their shelter. 20 yards to his left, Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Wizard Chen was applying pressure to Petty Officer First Class Alex Tank Rodriguez's leg wound, working by feel in the darkness. The bullet had shattered Rodriguez's femur, and despite Chen's best efforts, the medic's hands were slick with blood. To Morrison's right, the rest of Neptune 7 maintained their defensive perimeter with the mechanical precision that came from 8 years of operating together. Petty Officer Second Class Danny Prophet O'Brien worked his M110 sniper rifle like a surgical instrument, each shot claiming an enemy position. Behind him, Petty Officer Third Class Louis Breacher Santos and Petty Officer Second Class Mike Compass Williams covered the team's flanks with their M4A1 carbines, their muzzle flashes strobing in controlled bursts. But ammunition was finite, and the enemy seemed infinite. Morrison's tactical display showed at least 4 dozen hostiles in elevated positions, with more arriving from the valley below. Without air support, Neptune 7 would be overrun within the hour. The mountain ridges that had provided concealment during their insertion now formed a natural amphitheater that trapped them in a killing field. The distinctive whine of jet engines cut through the rifle fire, growing from whisper to roar as Shadowhawk's F-16 approached from the northwest. Morrison had worked with dozens of Air Force pilots over his 15-year career, but Lyra Castellanos was different. She flew like she was born to it, like the aircraft was an extension of her, rather than a machine she controlled. Neptune 7, Shadowhawk, tally target Alpha, 30 seconds to impact. Her voice carried across the radio with the calm precision of a surgeon announcing an incision. Morrison could see her aircraft now, a dark arrow against the star field, diving toward the enemy position with predatory grace. The AGM-65 Maverick missile separated from Shadowhawk's wing pylon with a sound like tearing silk, its solid fuel motor igniting in a brilliant orange flare that briefly turned night to day. For 3 seconds, the missile streaked through thin air, guided by its infrared seeker toward the heat signature of muzzle flashes and human bodies pressed against stone. The explosion removed the enemy position from existence, not destroyed, obliterated. Where 40 seconds earlier there had been a fortified fighting position carved from living rock, now there was only silence and settling dust. The shockwave rolled across the mountain bowl like thunder, and for a heartbeat, even the most disciplined Taliban fighters stopped shooting. Morrison keyed his radio. Shadowhawk, direct hit on Alpha, scratch 1 position. But Lyra was already lining up her next target, pulling her F-16 through a climbing turn that brought her nose to bear on the second enemy strongpoint. This position was more challenging, built into a reverse slope that provided natural protection from air attack, with overlapping fields of fire that had kept Neptune 7 pinned down for the past hour. Neptune 7, next target is danger close. I need you boys to keep your heads down. The second Maverick missile streaked downward like divine retribution, punching through the enemy position's overhead cover and detonating in a confined space that amplified the explosion's destructive power. Rock and debris fountained skyward, and when it settled, another source of enemy fire had been permanently silenced. 3 positions remained, but these were the most challenging, built directly into the cliff faces, with minimal heat signatures and maximum natural protection. Missiles would be ineffective. This would require the precision of cannon fire delivered at ranges where a single degree of error could mean friendly casualties. Lyra banked her F-16 into a knife-edge turn, bleeding airspeed and altitude, as she lined up for a strafing run that would bring her within 200 feet of Neptune 7's position. The 20 M61 Vulcan cannon spoke with the voice of controlled lightning, each round a precise punctuation mark in a sentence written across the mountainside. Lyra walked her fire across the third enemy position with surgical precision, the depleted uranium rounds chewing through rock and flesh with equal efficiency. Muzzle flashes died one by one as her cannon fire swept the position clean. But the fourth position remained, and it was the most dangerous, a heavy machine gun nest built into a natural cave system, its overlapping fields of fire covering the only viable extraction route. Taking it out would require a level of precision that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their absolute limits. Morrison watched Shadowhawk's F-16 pull up and around for another attack run, the aircraft's silhouette etched against stars that seemed impossibly distant. He'd seen good pilots before, pilots who could put ordnance on target with clinical precision. But this was different. This was artistry wrapped in violence, ballet performed at 400 knots with death as the only audience that mattered. Shadowhawk, that last position is giving us problems. Can you service it? There was a pause, and when Lyra's voice returned, it carried a note Morrison had heard only once before, on the day she'd flown cover while they carried Miguel home. Neptune 7, consider it done. The final strafing run took Lyra's F-16 so close to the mountainside that her wingtips nearly scraped stone. She rolled inverted, pulling negative Gs that pressed her into her ejection seat, her targeting reticule dancing across the cave mouth where enemy muzzle flashes strobed like evil eyes. At the last possible moment, she squeezed the trigger, sending a precise burst of 20 cannon fire into the narrow opening. The enemy machine gun fell silent. Morrison keyed his radio, his voice carrying relief and something deeper, gratitude that transcended military protocol. Shadowhawk, all enemy positions neutralized. Outstanding work. But there was no response from the F-16 climbing away into the star-drunk sky. Lyra Castellanos was already switching frequencies, coordinating with the Quick Reaction Force helicopter that would extract Neptune 7 from their mountain prison. Professional to the end, even when every shot had been fired in memory of her brother. 15 minutes later, as the MH-60 Blackhawk lifted Neptune 7 away from the killing ground, Morrison caught a glimpse of Shadowhawk's F-16 maintaining overwatch from 10,000 feet above. The aircraft's nose art was invisible in the darkness, but he knew it was there, that fierce-eyed woman who'd become legend among ground troops, painted by a crew chief who'd said she reminded him of his daughter. Tonight, she'd reminded Morrison of something else entirely, an angel of vengeance, carrying her brother's spirit into battle, bringing his team home when home seemed impossibly far away. The debrief took place in the sterile confines of the Joint Operations Center at Bagram Airfield, where fluorescent lights cast everything in the harsh geometry of military efficiency. Colonel James, Thunderbolt, Harrison, commanding officer of the 455th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron, sat across from Captain Castellanos at a metal table that had witnessed 1,000 similar conversations. The after-action report lay between them like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Textbook mission execution, Harrison began, his voice carrying the measured approval of a career officer who'd learned to parse excellence from expectation. 4 enemy positions neutralized, 0 friendly casualties, successful extraction of friendly forces. The SEALs are putting you in for a distinguished flying cross. Lyra nodded, her expression professionally neutral, but Harrison could see something else beneath the surface, a satisfaction that went deeper than military achievement. This hadn't been just another combat mission for her. This had been personal, and that made it both more dangerous and more necessary. "There's something else," Harrison continued, sliding a classified folder across the table. "Neptune 7's after-action interview mentioned your brother, Miguel Castellanos, call sign Ghost, killed in action 3 years ago." He paused, studying her reaction. "They wanted to make sure command understood the connection." Lyra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd known this conversation was coming from the moment she'd heard Morrison's voice on the radio. The military didn't like personal connections in combat zones. They created complications, introduced variables that couldn't be controlled or predicted. But sometimes, those connections were exactly what made the mission possible. "Ghost was Neptune 7's forward air controller," she said finally. "They carried him home when they could have left him behind. Tonight, I returned the favor." Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering. He'd flown combat missions in 3 different wars, had commanded fighter pilots from Nevada to Afghanistan, and he'd learned to recognize the difference between revenge and justice, between recklessness and calculated risk. What Castellanos had accomplished tonight fell firmly into the latter categories. "The mission parameters were within acceptable limits," he said after a moment. "Your ordnance placement was surgical. Your risk assessment was appropriate. If there's a connection between you and Neptune 7, it seems to have made you more effective, not less." He closed the folder and stood, extending his hand. "Outstanding work, Captain. Get some rest. You're flying again tomorrow." But sleep was the furthest thing from Lyra's mind as she walked across the airfield toward her quarters. The Afghan night was crisp at this altitude, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In the distance, she could see the lights of Hangar 7, where her F-16 waited for the next mission, the next emergency, the next chance to prove that some bonds transcended death itself. She thought about Miguel as she walked, remembering his laugh, his terrible jokes, his absolute confidence in her abilities even when she doubted herself. He'd been the one who'd encouraged her to apply for pilot training, who told her that being their father's daughter meant she was born to fly. He'd been wrong about many things, but not about that. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another crisis, another chance to turn the tide of a war that seemed to have no end. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Captain Lyra Castellanos slept without nightmares. At the Naval Special Warfare Compound 20 kilometers away, Senior Chief Morrison was writing his own after-action report, trying to find words for what had happened in those mountains. How did you explain the moment when professional competence transformed into something approaching the miraculous? How did you quantify the difference between good air support and having an angel watching over you? In the end, he settled for the facts. Mission accomplished, all personnel accounted for, enemy forces neutralized. But in the margins of his report, where official documentation gave way to personal observation, he added a single line that would be remembered long after the tactical details were forgotten. "Shadowhawk didn't just save our lives tonight. She kept faith with her brother." The Taliban commander who survived the mountain engagement would later tell his followers about the American pilot who fought like a jinn, appearing from darkness to rain destruction on anyone who threatened her chosen ones. The story would spread through insurgent networks, growing in the telling, until Shadowhawk became something more than a call sign. She became a myth, a cautionary tale, a reminder that some debts could never be settled, only paid forward. But myths had a way of taking on lives of their own, and in the months that followed, other ground units began requesting Shadowhawk by name when they found themselves in desperate situations. Her legend grew with each mission, each perfect weapons placement, each impossible extraction enabled by her precise application of controlled violence. The Air Force brass took notice, of course. Efficiency reports that read like fiction, commendations that accumulated like evidence of something unprecedented, performance metrics that suggested either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck, and luck wasn't something the military trusted as a sustainable combat asset. Colonel Harrison found himself fielding calls from Pentagon analysts who wanted to understand how a single pilot had achieved such consistent results in the most challenging combat environment on Earth. The questions always came back to the same central mystery. What made Shadowhawk different from every other pilot in theater? The answer, Harrison knew, couldn't be quantified in after-action reports or performance metrics. It lived in the space between personal loss and professional duty, in the alchemy that transformed grief into precision, in the understanding that some missions were about more than tactical objectives. Captain Lyra Castellanos had found her calling in the thin air above Afghanistan, but it had cost her everything she'd been before she pinned on those wings. The woman who joined the Air Force to honor her father's legacy had died in the same IED blast that claimed Miguel. What had emerged from that crucible was something harder, more focused, infinitely more dangerous. Shadowhawk wasn't just a pilot anymore. She was a force of nature, a precision instrument of American air power, a living reminder that some bonds were stronger than death itself. And in the months to come, both friend and enemy would learn exactly what that meant. The first hint that Shadowhawk had transcended normal pilot status came during a mission 6 weeks after the Neptune 7 rescue. Delta Force operators pinned down near the Pakistani border had requested immediate close air support, facing overwhelming odds in terrain that made precision bombing nearly impossible. 3 different F-16 pilots had attempted the mission and been forced to abort due to weather conditions that reduced visibility to near zero. Captain Castellanos took off into a sandstorm that had grounded every other aircraft at Bagram, flying by instruments through atmospheric conditions that would have challenged an airline pilot in peacetime. She delivered ordnance with surgical precision in zero visibility conditions, guided only by radio coordination with ground forces and an intuitive understanding of three-dimensional space that bordered on supernatural. The mission succeeded. The Delta operators survived, and word spread through special operations communities that Shadowhawk could fly in conditions that defeated other pilots, could place bombs with accuracy that defied explanation, could appear when needed regardless of weather, terrain, or tactical complexity. Soon, ground units were requesting her specifically for the most challenging missions. When Navy SEALs found themselves surrounded in the Korangal Valley, they asked for Shadowhawk. When Army Rangers needed precision bombing in urban environments where civilian casualties could create international incidents, they asked for Shadowhawk. When Marine Force recon teams required extraction from behind enemy lines, they asked for Shadowhawk. Each mission added to her legend, but also to her isolation. Other pilots began to avoid her in the officers' club, uncomfortable with the combination of reverence and resentment her reputation generated. Ground crews whispered about the way she seemed to communicate with her aircraft, the way her F-16 performed beyond manufacturer specifications when she was at the controls. Colonel Harrison watched this transformation with growing concern. Outstanding pilots were assets to be cultivated, but legends were dangerous. They attracted attention from enemies, created unrealistic expectations from allies, and placed impossible pressure on the individuals trapped inside their own mythology. He'd seen it before, in previous wars with previous pilots who'd achieved extraordinary things under extraordinary circumstances. Some had thrived under the pressure, becoming the larger-than-life figures their reputations suggested. Others had been crushed by expectations they could never consistently meet, their careers ending in flames as spectacular as their rise. The question was which category Captain Castellanos would ultimately occupy, and whether the Air Force would have any say in that determination. Because myths had a momentum all their own, and once a pilot crossed that threshold from excellent to legendary, the military machine had very little control over what happened next. In her sparse quarters at Bagram, surrounded by technical manuals and photographs that told the story of her life in fragments, Lyra Castellanos tried to process what her existence had become. The woman who joined the Air Force to honor her father's memory now found herself carrying the hopes and fears of dozens of ground units scattered across Afghanistan's unforgiving landscape. Each mission briefing brought new requests, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that reputation was more than rumor. But with each success, the weight of expectation grew heavier, the margin for error narrower, the distance between the pilot she'd been and the legend she'd become more unbridgeable. Late at night, when the airfield was quiet except for the distant rumble of cargo planes arriving from Kuwait, she would study the photograph tucked inside her helmet. 8 men in desert fatigues, arms thrown over each other's shoulders, grins wide as Texas sky. 7 of those faces belonged to SEAL Team 7. The 8th belonged to Miguel. She'd started this journey to honor his memory, to prove that his little sister could carry on the family tradition of service with distinction. But somewhere along the way, the mission had become larger than personal redemption. It had become about something fundamental to the nature of military service itself, the understanding that individual excellence, when properly applied, could alter the course of events far beyond any single person's apparent significance. Tomorrow would bring another mission, another chance to prove that Shadowhawk was more than myth, more than luck, more than the sum of her individual skills. It would bring another opportunity to demonstrate that some pilots transcended the normal limitations of physics, weather, and human endurance to become instruments of something approaching divine intervention. But tonight, Captain Lyra Castellanos sat alone with her memories and her responsibilities, trying to understand how honoring one brother's sacrifice had led her to become the guardian angel of an entire war. The mission that would define Shadowhawk's legend came on a February morning, when winter winds off the Hindu Kush turned the air above Bagram into a frozen razor. Intelligence reports had identified a high-value target, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating IED networks that had killed dozens of American soldiers, hiding in a compound near the Iranian border. The target was time-sensitive. Satellite surveillance indicated the commander would be in the compound for less than 6 hours before moving to a new location. The window for action was narrow, the stakes enormous, and the tactical challenges seemingly insurmountable. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by peaks that rose to 18,000 feet, creating a natural fortress that channeled approach routes through narrow corridors perfectly suited for surface-to-air missile ambushes. Weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly, with cloud cover dropping to 500 feet and winds gusting to 60 knots. 3 different mission planners had declared the target unsuitable for air attack, given current conditions. Captain Castellano studied the intelligence briefings with the focused intensity that had become her signature. Satellite imagery showed the compound's layout, thermal signatures indicating human presence, and meteorological data that painted a picture of atmospheric conditions bordering on impossible for precision aviation. But impossible was a relative term when measured against the lives that would be lost if this target escaped to continue his campaign of terror. The mathematics were simple: accept extraordinary risk now, or accept certain casualties later. For Shadowhawk, there was no real choice to be made. "I'll take the mission," she told Colonel Harrison during the emergency briefing. Her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd already calculated the odds and decided they were acceptable. Harrison studied her across the tactical display table, seeing something in her expression that reminded him of every great pilot he'd ever known. The absolute certainty that skill and will could overcome any obstacle the enemy or nature could present. Lyra, this isn't a standard CAS mission. The weather alone is enough to kill you before you get near the target. The terrain will funnel you through approach corridors that are basically shooting galleries. And if you somehow manage to thread all those needles, you'll have to deliver ordnance with precision that would be challenging under perfect conditions. She nodded, acknowledging each point without allowing any of them to change her fundamental conclusion. Sir, the target won't be there tomorrow. We take this shot now, or we don't take it at all. Harrison recognized the tone. He'd used it himself, years ago, when faced with missions that existed at the intersection of duty and impossibility. Sometimes the military asked its people to attempt things that couldn't be done, and sometimes those people found ways to do them anyway. Approved, he said finally. But Lyra, this one's different. This one's going to be remembered one way or another. She was already turning toward the door, her mind shifting into the operational mode that transformed Captain Castellanos into Shadowhawk. Then, let's make sure it's remembered for the right reasons. The pre-flight briefing took place in the Tactical Operations Center, where weather specialists painted a picture of atmospheric conditions that violated several basic assumptions about powered flight. Visibility near zero, turbulence severe enough to disable aircraft systems, wind shear that could tear wings off even the most robust fighter aircraft. But Captain Castellanos listened to each briefing with the focused attention of someone memorizing a map of territory she intended to traverse, cataloging challenges that would need to be overcome rather than obstacles that might prove insurmountable. The meteorologist concluded his presentation with a recommendation that the mission be postponed until conditions improved. The intelligence officer noted that postponement would mean losing the target permanently. The operations officer suggested waiting for a brief weather window that satellite projections indicated might open in 18 hours. Shadowhawk studied the tactical display one final time, her gaze tracing approach routes through mountain corridors that would challenge even her exceptional skills. The target compound appeared as a geometric pattern superimposed over satellite imagery, its walls and buildings arranged in the defensive configuration that had protected Afghan strongholds for centuries. "I'll be wheels up in 30 minutes, she announced, ending the briefing with the simple declaration that transformed discussion into action. As she walked toward Hangar 7, Captain Castellanos felt the familiar transformation beginning, the process by which fear became focus, doubt became determination, and the woman who carried her brother's memory became the precision instrument of warfare that ground forces across Afghanistan had learned to trust with their lives. Tonight, she would fly through conditions that should have been impossible, navigate terrain that should have been impenetrable, and deliver ordnance with accuracy that should have been unachievable. Tonight, she would prove that legends were sometimes just truth that hadn't been properly documented. The F-16 sat in Hangar 7 like a predatory bird, awaiting its moment to hunt, nose arc gleaming under fluorescent lights that painted everything in harsh military geometry. Ground crews had loaded her aircraft with a specialized ordnance package, 2 GBU-12 Paveway laser-guided bombs, selected for their precision capabilities in the confined target environment. Chief Master Sergeant Ricardo Tank Valdez supervised the weapons loading with the methodical precision of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times, but never under circumstances quite like these. Valdez had worked with every pilot in the 455th Expeditionary Fighter Squadron, had prepped aircraft for missions that pushed both machines and aviators to their absolute limits. But Shadowhawk was different. She moved around her aircraft with an intimacy that suggested partnership rather than operation, checking systems and ordnance loads with touches that seemed almost affectionate. Other pilots treated their F-16s as sophisticated tools. She treated hers as an extension of her, while made manifest in aluminum and titanium. "Weather's looking ugly out there, ma'am," Valdez offered as she completed her pre-flight inspection. He'd served long enough to recognize the signs when a mission crossed the line from dangerous to potentially suicidal. Lyra paused in her inspection of the left-wing pylon, meeting his gaze with eyes that carried the focused intensity of someone who'd already accepted whatever consequences awaited in the darkness above Afghanistan. "Tank, how long have you been loading weapons for combat missions?" 23 years, ma'am. Desert Storm through today." "In all that time, have you ever seen ordnance come back unused because the pilot was afraid of a little weather?" Valdez grinned despite himself. He'd heard stories about Shadowhawk's dry sense of humor, her ability to reduce the most complex tactical situations to simple questions of professional competence versus professional cowardice. "No, ma'am, I have not." "Then let's make sure tonight doesn't set any new precedents." She climbed into the cockpit with movements that had been refined through hundreds of combat sorties, each action flowing seamlessly into the next as she transformed from pilot to weapon system operator. The F-16 systems came alive under her touch, displays illuminating the cockpit with data streams that told the story of an aircraft prepared for violence. Engine start was routine, the Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan spinning up to operational parameters with the smooth progression that indicated perfect mechanical health. But as Shadowhawk taxied toward the runway, ground personnel noticed something different about this departure. The aircraft seemed to move with unusual purposefulness, as if both machine and pilot were eager to engage whatever challenges waited in the storm-swept mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Tower, Shadowhawk requesting immediate departure for combat mission. Shadowhawk Tower, weather conditions are below minimums for fighter operations. Recommend holding until conditions improve. There was a pause, and when her voice returned over the radio, it carried the quiet authority of someone who'd made calculations the tower couldn't see, had factored variables the meteorologists hadn't considered. "Tower, mission is time-critical. Weather conditions are acceptable for this aircraft and this pilot." "Shadowhawk, you're cleared for takeoff runway 27. Godspeed." The afterburner ignition lit up the runway like a controlled explosion, painting Hangar 7 and the surrounding infrastructure in orange light that lasted exactly long enough for witnesses to understand they were watching something unprecedented. At 180 knots, Shadowhawk's F-16 rotated into a climb angle that carried her directly into cloud cover so thick it swallowed her.